One joke, one silent man, and an entire room that stopped breathing. When Jasmine Crockett laughed, she thought she owned the stage. But when a father in the third row rose without saying a single word, he changed the conversation, the audience, and maybe even America itself. Watch how silence speaks louder than outrage. Before we dive into this unforgettable moment of quiet strength and public reckoning, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to Tailbeam. We bring you real, raw, and resonant stories that remind us why some voices never need to shout to be heard. It was supposed to be just another lively political broadcast, polished, provocative, and predictably partisan. Jasmine Crockett entered the auditorium like she owned it. She wore her confidence like armor, every gesture deliberate, every word sharpened for impact. The crowd was hers, or so it seemed. Midway through the discussion, Crockett cracked a joke, light, sarcastic, and aimed subtly at her co-panelist, Kash Patel. Her lips curved into a smug, knowing smile as the words left her mouth. To her, it was clever, a throwaway line designed to draw laughs and showcase her wit. But instead of applause or laughter, she was met with silence. Thick, unyielding silence. Patel didn't respond. He didn't even flinch. His eyes lowered, fingers tapping the edge of the table once, twice, then stopping, as if sealing something unsaid. The host, Michael Hayes, shifted awkwardly in his seat. Even the production crew faltered. A cameraman raised his hand behind the lens, unsure whether to cut or hold. No one was laughing. Not the audience, not the panel, and most notably, not the older man seated in the third row. He was quiet, still, wearing a gray suit, his posture perfect, his gaze unblinking. On his chest was a small badge with 3 stars, one faded, 2 bright. He wasn't listed as a guest. He wasn't introduced. But the weight of the room seemed to bend toward him in that moment, as if gravity itself knew he was there for a reason no one understood yet. Jasmine hadn't seen him. Not yet. She was too caught in the momentum of her delivery, too certain the crowd was on her side. But something had shifted. There was a crack in the atmosphere, a disruption in the carefully staged performance. Up to that point, she had controlled everything, the rhythm, the rhetoric, the room. Michael Hayes leaned toward her. The camera zoomed in on her hands, her expressions. She had the power, but power is fragile, and jokes, when built on unseen pain, don't always land softly. What no one knew in that moment was that her words didn't just misfire. They touched a nerve buried deep in lived experience, a wound carried silently by the man no one had noticed until now. This wasn't just about being right or wrong. This was about knowing when silence isn't absence, it's presence. And so the question hung unspoken in the air. Did Jasmine Crockett know who was in the room when she laughed? Jasmine Crockett moved like a force of nature on stage. Dressed in a deep green blazer, hair pulled tight, every step and smile calculated to command attention. She didn't just take the stage, she claimed it. The audience was hers, and the lights seemed to affirm it, bathing her in a golden glow as if fate had lit her path. From the moment she spoke, Crockett didn't just participate, she dominated. Her voice was poised, her timing perfect. She knew how to play a room. A quip here, a clever pause there, each word a chess piece, carefully moved. When she leaned into a controversial comment about political polarization, the crowd responded on cue. Laughter, claps, nods of approval. It was smooth, seamless. She wasn't just speaking, she was performing. Beside her, Kash Patel sat in quiet contrast. Dressed in a black suit, every detail of his appearance sharp, deliberate, restrained. He didn't move much, didn't speak. His stillness made him almost invisible until you realized how much space he actually held. Then came the shift. Michael Hayes, the host, turned to Patel with a question, a soft probe about representation and voice. It was framed politely, even gently, but you could hear the edge buried within it. Patel responded with a few quiet words, calmly deflecting the earlier remark. That comment wasn't meant for me. The room froze. Not dramatically, not visibly, but internally, as if time hiccuped. It wasn't just what Patel said, it was how he said it. Steady, flat, but unmistakably loaded. In that moment, something subtle but seismic happened. The room's emotional temperature shifted. The performance began to crack, not in front of Crockett, but beneath her. Still, she pressed on. Emboldened by past applause, Crockett delivered another sharp line, this one hinting that some people only end up on camera because they fit the story the media wants to tell. It was clever, too clever. The audience chuckled nervously, unsure whether to laugh or think harder. No name was mentioned, but everyone knew who she meant. And that's when he lifted his head. The man in the third row, the one no one noticed, looked up. He didn't frown, didn't gesture. He just watched her. And suddenly, Jasmine Crockett felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not shame, but a quiet pressure, like being observed not as a public figure, but as a person. Her next sentence came slower. Her smile tightened. Her laugh stumbled slightly, not from nerves, but from dissonance. Because now, Kash Patel wasn't the only silent one in the room. Now, silence had a face. Michael Hayes tried to steer the conversation forward. He asked a question about female politicians and media misrepresentation. It was a softball, easy, affirming. Crockett answered quickly and cleanly. I'm not misunderstood for being a woman. I'm misunderstood for refusing to apologize for what I believe. Applause again, but thinner this time. Delayed, mechanical. A few people clapped automatically. A young woman nodded, and someone in the back began typing on their phone. But there was hesitation now, subtle but real. The kind of hesitation that grows in spaces where certainty has started to rot. And then the most unsettling thing happened. Crockett began to notice. She began to glance, not at Patel, but toward the audience, toward him, the man who hadn't spoken, the man who hadn't moved, but whose gaze now shaped the energy of the room more than any host, camera, or politician. She smiled again, but this time it was thinner, more practiced. And behind that smile, a thought crept in. What if I crossed a line that didn't belong to me? Because something was different. The audience wasn't against her, but they weren't with her anymore, either. They had paused. And once an audience pauses, it listens. Up until now, the silence in the room had been merely unsettling. Like a pause in conversation, or a moment of hesitation before laughter. But when Kash Patel finally spoke, it wasn't just silence that ended. It was the illusion that this was just a show. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't point fingers. He didn't even look at Jasmine Crockett. Instead, his voice came low and measured, but weighted with something deeper than rebuttal. My father is in the audience today. A ripple passed through the auditorium, so subtle it didn't move the air, but it moved people. Dozens of heads turned, eyes searching, scanning rows they had previously ignored. And there he was, the man in the gray suit, 3 stars pinned to his chest. One faded, 2 bright, sitting perfectly still in the third row. He didn't wave, he didn't acknowledge the room, he didn't even react to the shift in attention. But he didn't have to. His presence was enough. Jasmine Crockett turned too. Her eyes landed on him. And in that instant, something fell away. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't public, but inside her something dropped. A truth she hadn't accounted for, a presence she hadn't considered. In just a few heartbeats, everything she had said before, every quip, every jab, every laugh, was no longer suspended in theory. It was grounded now, real. And it had landed in a room that was listening all along. For the first time in the entire event, she didn't have a line to fall back on. She didn't have a rhetorical flourish to deflect with. She just stared, and the man stared back. No fury, no sadness, no forgiveness, just stillness, the kind that holds a mirror and dares you to see what's truly there. Michael Hayes, the host, didn't speak. Maybe he knew that any word now would feel like a stain on the moment. Even the crew had stopped moving. The hum of lights, the quiet shuffle of camera equipment, it all fell away. The entire room had been claimed not by performance, but by presence. Patel placed his hand gently on the glass table in front of him, not as punctuation, but as anchor, as if bracing himself against the tide of memory now rising in his chest. I grew up in a family where my father was asked every day, "Where are you from?" And when he answered, "I was born here," they pressed, "No, where are you really from?" His voice never wavered. It wasn't a monologue, it was a confession wrapped in steel. Not bitter, not broken, but burdened. Today, when someone says you're only here because you were chosen for an agenda, and they say it in front of him, he looked at Crockett, not to attack, but to make sure she understood. You might think it's a joke, but to us, it's an old wound, one that never really heals. And still, the man in the third row didn't move. He didn't nod in agreement, he didn't beam with pride, he simply existed, as proof, as history, as the why behind Patel's every breath. Crockett leaned forward slightly, just a fraction of an inch. The cameras weren't on her, but it didn't matter. She wasn't leaning into debate anymore. She was leaning into awareness. She opened her mouth, maybe to apologize, maybe to recover, but nothing came. The room no longer needed explanation. The silence had explained everything. And for the audience, this wasn't a panel anymore. It was a lesson, a reckoning, a moment that asked not who's right, but who are you when someone else is hurting. Crockett had once said, "I know I can be blunt, but Americans need to be a little less sensitive." But now no one clapped, no one laughed. Because no one wanted to play that game anymore. Across the room, breaths were being held, not out of tension, but out of reflection. The man in the third row had never spoken, he had never gestured, but he had shifted the moral center of the entire event. His silence was louder than every sound that had come before it. And Jasmine Crockett, who had faced senators, protesters, pundits, suddenly found herself unsure of where to look. Because in that moment, she realized, it's not the backlash that breaks you, it's the quiet you didn't see coming. The auditorium wasn't quiet anymore, it was still. Still in a way that didn't invite noise, but demanded attention. Not from a place of tension, but reverence. The man in the third row, the one whose presence had been ignored for most of the show, had shifted the axis of the conversation with nothing more than posture and presence. And now, after that long, soul-hollowing silence, the room waited for what came next. Kash Patel looked down. His hand rested on the glass table again, but this time it wasn't to steady himself. It was something else, something grounding, something sacred. He looked up and spoke again. Not to Crockett, not to the camera, not even to the host. This time, he was speaking directly to the room. To anyone who had ever asked a version of that old ugly question, "Where are you really from?" "I thought I understood my father," he began, his voice smooth but weathered, "until I learned he'd been called an immigrant only good for odd jobs, despite building a career that helped change lives. No music, no camera pan, just his voice, carrying years." "He never told me that story," Patel said. "I overheard it. My mother mentioned it once at dinner." There was a small, almost invisible shift in the audience. Someone in the second row bowed their head, not in shame, but in shared recognition, as if they, too, had heard such stories whispered at tables. And like Patel had realized only later the weight of what was said. I asked him why he never told me, and he said, "Because I didn't want you to carry bitterness, I wanted you to carry light." A breath, a pause, the kind of silence that wasn't empty, it was full, a full silence, a respectful one. Somewhere, someone shifted in their seat, another reached instinctively for a hand beside them, and Jasmine Crockett, who had once radiated control, now sat quietly, not silenced, but changed. Her gaze, previously fixed on the audience like a performer scanning for reaction, was now internal. Looking inward, listening, finally, Patel continued, not louder but deeper. "I used to think my father was too gentle, maybe too forgiving, but when I was 16, I watched him walk into an immigration policy hearing." He paused. He was the only Indian in the room. More silence. And he didn't tremble. He didn't hedge his words. And after he spoke, I asked him, "Weren't you afraid?" He looked at me and said, "I'm not afraid of their silence, I'm afraid of mine." The words didn't echo. They settled into hearts, into memories, into the unspoken spaces between people. He wasn't trying to win anymore. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He was just telling the truth. And in truth, something sacred happens. People stop defending, and they start listening. Even Jasmine Crockett was listening now. You could see it in the way she had turned, not in defense, not in regret, but in recognition. Her face had softened. Her breath was slower. She wasn't preparing a rebuttal. She was receiving something new. "When I entered politics," Patel said, "my father didn't congratulate me. He just said, 'You won't be destroyed by the cruelty of others. You'll be destroyed by the words people say when they think no one's listening.'" Then he turned to the camera. A deliberate turn. Not for performance, but for permanence. Today someone said, it was just a joke. But every joke has an audience. And sometimes, that audience is someone who never speaks. If this moment moved you, take a second to subscribe. We share stories like this, where silence speaks and presence changes everything. The air in the room shifted again, not from discomfort this time, but from awareness. Real awareness. The kind that doesn't clap. It contemplates. Michael Hayes, for once, stepped away from his notes. No teleprompter cues, no clever transitions. He simply bowed his head for a moment and said softly, "I think sometimes the most important things we say aren't in any of the questions." And that's when the transformation became real. Jasmine Crockett didn't apologize. Not publicly. Not with words, but she did lower her head. Not in defeat, not in shame, but in acknowledgement. The camera wisely didn't push in. It just lingered, letting the moment breathe, letting the audience feel something that wasn't scripted. And for the first time in the entire exchange, the man in the third row, Patel's father, smiled. Not wide, not performative, just enough. Enough to show he had been seen, enough to say, "That's all I needed." The show ended without fanfare, no roaring applause, no triumphant exit, no winner declared. Just a moment, the kind that hangs in the air like a breath you forget to release. The cameras cut, the stage lights dimmed, and people shuffled out, some talking quietly, most not talking at all. What happened wasn't dramatic, it was something far rarer, undeniably human. And that's why the story didn't go viral right away. There was no scandal to exploit, no explosive soundbite, no shouting match. Just a man who stood, then sat. Just a son who spoke, then stopped. And a room that had no choice but to listen. It began as a whisper. A journalism student with 417 followers clipped the moment and posted it on social media. No clickbait title, no fancy edit, just the caption. Not because he was strong, but because he spoke of pain without asking anyone to cry for him. A few hours later, a father in Virginia reposted the video with a different caption. "I used to laugh along with just kidding jokes. Now I teach my son never to say those words unless he knows who's in the room." It wasn't sensational. It was sincere. And sincerity has a strange way of spreading, slowly, quietly, but permanently. The clip made its way to a high school in Seattle, where a social studies teacher played it without introduction. After the video ended, she passed out a single handwritten question. What makes someone change an entire room without saying a word? Most students stared at the paper for a while before writing. One wrote, "Because he was a father." Another wrote, "Because he didn't accuse, but we still knew what he meant." An Indian American student wrote, "Because it was the first time I saw someone like my dad, not being asked to explain himself." At a church in Birmingham, Alabama, a pastor opened his Sunday sermon by showing the clip of the man standing and sitting. He didn't preach after it. He simply said, "Faith doesn't come from the person who's right. Faith comes from the one who says nothing and still makes you want to do right." And quietly, without prompting, without hashtags or campaigns, the phrase "just kidding" began to disappear from everyday speech. People didn't cancel it. They just outgrew it. Late-night hosts referenced the moment, not as a punchline, but with pause. One segment aired the clip in total silence, no commentary, just the moment Patel's father stood, then sat down. 1 minute of reverence on a network that usually made fun of everything. Even politicians started picking up the phrase, "someone stood up," with no context needed. Across party lines, that phrase didn't belong to any ideology. It belonged to something older, something deeper. And what of Jasmine Crockett? She disappeared from the spotlight for a few days, not in scandal, not from backlash, just absence. Her team issued a quiet statement. Jasmine is taking time to reflect and be with family. No PR spin, no tweet storm. She didn't rush to defend herself, she didn't reframe the narrative, she let the moment breathe. And when she finally returned, weeks later on a podcast, she was different. When asked, "Do you have any regrets this year?" she paused for 3 full seconds, then replied, "I wish I'd known a father was in the audience. Not every remark deserves to be a joke just because I laughed first." No applause. No outrage. But no one scrolled past that clip either. In Baltimore, a high school principal printed a still image from the show, Patel's father rising to his feet. She taped it behind her desk. When asked why, she said, "Because I want students to pause before they speak, and silence is harder to ignore when it has a face." In Atlanta, a bookstore owner taped the same image behind the register, no caption. When customers asked, the owner simply said, "Because sometimes silence should stop you." In California, a freshman journalism student took a photo of Patel sitting backstage after the show. Alone. No phone, no staff, just him, staring down at the notes he never used. She posted it with the caption, "I used to think strength meant never being wrong. Last night I met someone strong enough to admit they were." And that's how it spread. Not like wildfire, but like seeds. Quietly, intentionally. Rooting themselves in classrooms, courtrooms, churches, dinner tables. A moment that hadn't been planned, hadn't been scripted, was now living in the very fabric of how people talk, pause, and reconsider their words. Because the truth is, some moments don't break the world, they rebuild it. One glance, one pause, one father standing, and a country remembering that words are never just jokes when someone in the room has carried the weight of hearing them too many times before. The news cycle had moved on. Other stories filled the feeds: elections, celebrity scandals, sports scores. But the moment still lived, not as a trending topic, not as a meme, but as a memory, a quiet, persistent one that refused to fade. Across the country, something subtle had shifted. At another talk show weeks later, a conservative guest began to launch into a tired monologue about political correctness and people chosen to fit an agenda. But the host, an otherwise neutral figure, interrupted gently. Not combatively, not performatively. He simply said, "Sorry, but we've had a conversation that taught us some things don't belong in the humor section anymore." The guest blinked, paused, the audience fell quiet. No one cheered, no one booed, but everyone understood. It wasn't censorship, it was evolution. Elsewhere, Kash Patel continued his work. He never addressed the show again, never gave interviews about the moment. But those who met with him in hearings or community events began to notice something new. After each meeting, Patel would close his notes, then look around the room. 3 seconds. Silent, still, intentional. He never explained why. But those who had seen the American Pulse interview knew what he was doing. He was leaving room. For reflection, for presence. For someone in the back row who might never speak, but was always listening. And others began to follow. In a nonprofit office in D.C., someone anonymously posted a memo on the bulletin board. It read, "Progress doesn't always come with loud rebuttals. Sometimes it arrives when someone pauses, listens, and chooses not to continue." At a high school in Chicago, a teacher printed the still image of Patel's father standing and taped it on the wall above her whiteboard. Below it, one sentence: "What can silence change?" No one laughed when they saw it. No one questioned it either. The phrase, "just kidding," quietly fell out of rotation. Not because anyone banned it, but because it didn't feel right anymore. The line no longer landed. Not after the room had remembered that every joke has an audience, and sometimes the one not laughing is the one carrying the heaviest burden. And what about Jasmine Crockett? She returned to her role. No grand rebrand, no teary apology tour, but she was different. During a particularly tense congressional hearing on judicial reform, an opponent launched a personal jab, something she would have once met with fire. But this time she waited. 3 seconds. Then responded, not with sharpness, but with stillness. Reporters noted it. Critics tried to stir the pot. But insiders understood. She hadn't lost her edge. She had learned control. A political columnist later wrote, "Jasmine Crockett didn't win the debate that day. She won something more powerful. She made the room pause and wonder if maybe we should all speak a little less." Back in Virginia, Patel's father never gave an interview. He didn't attend rallies. He never stepped onto another stage. But months later, at a small community fair, a vendor noticed an older man standing off to the side, quietly observing the crowd. A badge with 3 stars glinting in the sunlight. "Excuse me, sir," the vendor asked. "Are you someone important?" The man smiled. "I'm just a father," he said, and that was enough. The image from the show, of him rising, found its way into more places. A university library in Oregon, a courthouse in Michigan. A podcast cover hosted by 2 young activists in New York titled simply "Before You Speak," and everywhere that image appeared, it carried no caption. Because by now, it didn't need one. People knew. People remembered. A student in Seattle, once unsure how to speak up, posted on their blog, "I used to think you had to speak loudly to be heard. Now I know, sometimes standing is enough." This wasn't a viral moment. It was a values moment. A moment that didn't burn bright, but burned deep. It showed us that change doesn't always need a microphone. Sometimes it needs a pause, a gaze, a decision to say nothing, because silence will say everything. A joke led to a reckoning. A laugh revealed a blind spot. A father stood. And suddenly a nation realized, maybe we've been too loud to hear the people who never get to speak. Sometimes it's not the loudest voice that changes the room. It's the one that says nothing, because it's already lived the story. Jasmine Crockett didn't lose an argument. She met a moment she hadn't prepared for. And Kash Patel? He didn't fight back. He held space for a father, for a memory, for the truth. And maybe that's what we all need to learn to do. So before you click away, pause, ask yourself, who's in the room when I speak, and who's listening, even in silence? Until next time, stay kind, stay aware, and never underestimate the quiet ones.